They told me I was imagining things, that my trembling hands were just from old age, that my forgetfulness was normal, harmless. But the hospital room was cold, sterile, and the doctor's whispered words hit me harder than any blow. We need to act now. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. I'm sitting here in my small Manhattan apartment on the Upper West Side, where I've lived for 37 years. The morning light filters through windows that could use a good cleaning, casting shadows across my worn wooden floor. I can hear the familiar symphony of New York, honking taxis, construction hammers, voices in languages I don't understand but somehow find comforting. This city has been my home, my witness, my sanctuary, and lately, my prison. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 74 years old. My hands shake now when I pour my morning coffee, not from Parkinson's, as I'd feared, but from something far more sinister, something I never could have imagined. The ceramic mug my late husband Robert gave me 30 years ago trembles against the saucer, creating a soft clinking sound that seems to echo in this apartment that feels too quiet, too empty. I wake up every morning at 6:30, just as I have for decades. The ritual is the same. Feet on the cold hardwood floor, shuffle to the bathroom, splash cold water on my face that shows every line of worry, every sleepless night. I look in the mirror and see my mother's eyes staring back at me, blue, tired, but still holding hope, though that hope has been fading, day by day, month by month. The apartment smells like lavender fabric softener and the faint aroma of yesterday's soup. I keep it clean, spotless even, because that's what good mothers do. We maintain order, we create warmth, we make everything look perfect, even when our hearts are breaking. The photographs on my mantelpiece tell the story of a life well lived. My wedding day in 1972, Robert in his Navy uniform, David's first steps, his graduation from high school, his wedding day where his smile seemed genuine, real. But yesterday changed everything. Yesterday, I received a text message from my son David, my only child, the boy I nursed through chickenpox and nightmares, the young man I supported through college and his dreams of becoming an actor in Los Angeles. The message was simple, casual, devastating in its indifference. "Can't make lunch today, Mom. Something came up. Rain check?" It was the fourth time this month. The fourth cancellation, the fourth broken promise, the fourth reminder that I no longer matter enough for 2 hours of his time. I stood there, holding my phone with those shaking hands, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart. That had been fracturing for months. Something deeper. My faith, maybe. My belief that family means something. I walked to my bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, where I keep the things too precious to display, but too meaningful to throw away. Robert's love letters from Vietnam, David's first tooth, report cards with gold stars, a savings passbook showing the money I'd set aside for my grandson's college fund, money that somehow kept disappearing, withdrawal after withdrawal, always with David's name on the signature line. The familiar weight of those memories felt heavier that morning. I could smell Robert's cologne on the letters, Old Spice mixed with hope and love and promises of forever. He'd been gone 8 years now, and not a day passed that I didn't miss his steady presence, his way of making me feel safe, valued, loved without conditions or expectations. I remember thinking, as I sat on the edge of my bed with those letters in my lap, how Robert would have handled David's behavior. He would have drawn the line years ago. He would have said, "Son, your mother deserves better than this." But Robert wasn't here to protect me anymore, and I'd spent so long protecting everyone else that I'd forgotten how to protect myself. The phone rang around 10 that morning. David's voice, bright and cheerful, as if the canceled lunch meant nothing. "Hey, Mom, quick favor. Could you cover my car payment this month? Things are tight, and you know how it is in LA. The industry's brutal." I found myself saying yes, as always. Yes to the car payment, yes to the insurance, yes to the credit card bills and the rent and the groceries and the endless stream of emergencies that always seemed to happen right before he needed money. I'd been saying yes for so long that no felt like a foreign word, a sound I'd forgotten how to make. But something was different this time. As I hung up the phone and reached for my checkbook, the one Robert had taught me to balance so carefully, the one that showed decades of our shared responsibility and love. I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The handwriting on the most recent entries wasn't mine. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever felt that moment when reality shifts beneath your feet? When everything you thought you knew about your life, your family, your safety, suddenly becomes questionable? That's what happened to me in that moment. Staring at handwriting that looked like mine but wasn't quite right. I've always been careful with money. Robert and we weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. He worked as an electrician for the MTA for 38 years, and I taught third grade at PS 163 until I retired. We saved carefully, invested in a modest portfolio of stocks that grew steadily over the years. We even bought some Bitcoin early on, back when David convinced us it was the future. Our net worth wasn't millions, but it was enough. Enough for dignity, enough for independence, enough to help our family when they truly needed it. But as I flipped through that checkbook, seeing entry after entry in handwriting that resembled mine but felt wrong somehow, I began to understand that my careful savings, my modest fortune, my security, it was all disappearing faster than I'd realized. The numbers told a story I didn't want to believe. Thousands of dollars in withdrawals, investment accounts liquidated, Bitcoin transfers to addresses I didn't recognize. My assets, accumulated over decades of careful budgeting and modest investing, were vanishing like morning mist. I called my bank, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. Margaret at customer service, she'd known me for 15 years, had helped me when Robert died, and I had to learn to manage everything alone. Her voice was gentle but concerned when I asked about the recent activity on my accounts. "Mrs. Patterson," she said carefully, "those transactions were all authorized with your PIN and signature. We have copies if you'd like to review them." My PIN. The same 4 numbers I'd used for 20 years. David's birthday. The birthday I'd celebrated with chocolate cake and wrapped presents and proud photographs every August since he was born. The numbers he'd guessed so easily when he started helping me with my banking after Robert died, when the paperwork felt overwhelming and I was grateful for any assistance. That afternoon, I sat in Dr. Martinez's office for my regular checkup. Dr. Martinez had been my physician for 12 years, a kind woman from the Dominican Republic who practiced on Amsterdam Avenue. She'd guided me through menopause, helped me manage my blood pressure, held my hand when Robert's cancer diagnosis came back terminal. But this visit felt different. Dr. Martinez frowned as she reviewed my chart, asking about medications I didn't remember taking, symptoms I couldn't quite explain. My blood work showed irregularities, vitamin deficiencies, mineral imbalances, signs of chronic stress that seemed severe even for a 74-year-old widow living alone in New York. "Eleanor," she said, leaning forward with concern creasing her kind face, "I'm seeing some things here that worry me. Your magnesium levels are dangerously low. Your B12 is severely depleted. These aren't just signs of aging. Something is interfering with your body's ability to process nutrients properly." She asked me to bring in all my medications, supplements, anything I'd been taking regularly. I promised I would, but something cold settled in my stomach as I walked home along Broadway, past the familiar delis and bookstores that had been my neighbors for decades. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and I found myself looking over my shoulder, feeling watched, followed, though the busy sidewalk held only strangers going about their lives. That evening, I gathered every pill bottle from my medicine cabinet, blood pressure medication prescribed by Dr. Martinez, calcium supplements I'd been taking for bone health, a multivitamin David had recommended, one he'd actually purchased for me during his last visit, insisting it was better than the generic brand I usually bought. Something about better absorption, higher quality ingredients. I lined them all up on my kitchen table under the bright fluorescent light. The bottles looked innocent enough, but as I examined them more closely, I noticed things that made my skin crawl. The multivitamin bottle had a slight residue around the cap, as if it had been opened and resealed. The calcium supplements, pills that should have been pure white, had a faint, yellowish tinge, and the blood pressure medication felt lighter than usual, as if some pills were missing. I called David that night, my voice trembling with something between fear and rage. "David, I need to ask you something. and I need you to be honest with me. Have you been in my medicine cabinet? The pause on the other end of the line stretched too long. When he finally answered, his voice had that practiced casualness I'd been hearing more often lately. Mom, you're being paranoid. I helped you organize your pills last time I was there, remember? You were getting confused about which ones to take when, but I hadn't been confused. I'd been managing my own medications just fine until recently, until the trembling started, until the memory lapses began, until I started feeling weak and disoriented in ways that terrified me. David, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I'm going to ask you one more time and I want the truth. Are you doing something to my medication? This time the pause was followed by anger. Mom, what are you suggesting? That I'm trying to hurt you? That's insane. You're obviously not thinking clearly if you're making accusations like that. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me standing in my kitchen with those suspicious pill bottles and a growing certainty that my own son, the baby I'd rocked to sleep, the child I'd sacrificed everything for, was slowly poisoning me. I want you to think about that for a moment. Imagine discovering that someone you love, someone you've devoted your life to protecting and supporting, might be deliberately harming you. Can you imagine that betrayal? That complete violation of trust? The next morning, I made a decision that terrified me. I took all my medications to a pharmacy on the Lower East Side, far from my usual neighborhood, far from anywhere David might think to look for me. I asked the pharmacist, a young man with kind eyes and careful hands, if he could test the contents of my pills. He looked surprised, but didn't question my request. Maybe he'd seen this before. Maybe the city had taught him not to judge the desperate measures people take to protect themselves. He said it would take a few days. But yes, they could analyze the contents and compare them to what the labels claimed. Those were the longest 3 days of my life. I stopped taking all my medications, unsure what was safe and what might be slowly killing me. I felt better almost immediately, clearer, more alert. Though whether that was from removing something harmful or simply from the relief of taking action, I couldn't tell. David called twice during those 3 days. Both times, he asked about money. The first call was about his rent. Apparently, he was 3 months behind and facing eviction. The second was about a car repair, something about brakes and safety, and how he couldn't work if he couldn't drive safely in Los Angeles. Both times, I found myself saying something I'd never said before. I need to think about it. The surprise in his voice was almost comical. Think about what, Mom? I'm your son. This is what families do. They help each other. But help, I was beginning to understand, was supposed to flow both ways. Families were supposed to protect each other, not prey on each other. Sons were supposed to care for aging mothers, not see them as sources of income to be managed and manipulated. On Friday afternoon, the pharmacy called. The pharmacist's voice was careful, professional, but I could hear the concern underneath. Mrs. Patterson, could you come in? I think it would be better if we discussed the results in person. My heart hammered as I walked the 20 blocks downtown, past Washington Square Park, where college students sat on benches reading and laughing, past street vendors selling hot dogs and pretzels, past the ordinary life of a city that suddenly felt foreign and dangerous. The pharmacist, whose name tag read Kevin, showed me the results with gentle hands and careful words. The blood pressure medication had been tampered with, pills removed and replaced with something else, something that would lower my blood pressure dangerously if I took the prescribed dose. The calcium supplements contained a compound that actually blocked calcium absorption, explaining the growing weakness in my bones. And the multivitamins David had so thoughtfully provided contained small amounts of a substance that would cause confusion, memory loss, and trembling, all symptoms that could easily be attributed to natural aging. This is systematic, Kevin said quietly. Someone has been very carefully creating the appearance of cognitive decline while actually inducing it. Mrs. Patterson, you need to report this to the police. I sat in that pharmacy for nearly an hour, staring at the test results, trying to process the reality that my son, my only child, the person I trusted most in the world, had been slowly poisoning me for months. Not to kill me, I realized, but to make me seem incompetent, confused, in need of management. It was a sophisticated form of financial abuse, designed to justify taking control of my money, my decisions, my life. Every time David expressed concern about my forgetfulness, every time he suggested I was too old to manage my own affairs, every time he gently took over another aspect of my independence, it had all been part of a carefully orchestrated plan. That weekend, I didn't call David back. For the first time in months, I let my phone ring without answering when his name appeared on the screen. I sat in my apartment, looking out at the city I loved, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Silence that wasn't lonely, but peaceful. I made myself a cup of tea using the china my mother had passed down to me, delicate porcelain with tiny roses painted along the rim. As I sipped that tea, I made a mental inventory of everything I'd lost over the past 2 years. Not just money, though that loss was substantial. I'd lost my confidence, my sense of safety, my faith in my own mind. I'd lost the joy of being David's mother, replaced by the constant anxiety of trying to meet his endless demands. But I'd also discovered something I'd forgotten I possessed: my own strength. For 74 years, I'd survived everything life threw at me. The Depression-era childhood that taught me to value every penny. The years of marriage that brought deep love and occasional struggle. Raising a child while working full-time. Caring for Robert through his final illness. Rebuilding my life as a widow. I was Eleanor Patterson, and I was not a victim. I was a survivor. Sunday morning, I called David back. When he answered, his voice carried that familiar note of irritation mixed with concern, the perfect performance of a dutiful son dealing with a difficult mother. "Mom, where have you been? I've been worried sick." "I've been thinking," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months. "About what?" "About trust. About respect. About what it means to be family." There was a pause, then that carefully modulated concern again. "Mom, you're scaring me. Are you feeling okay? Maybe I should fly out there. Make sure you're taking your medications properly." The medications. Of course he would mention the medications. I felt a cold clarity settle over me, sharp and clean as winter air. "David," I said, "we need to talk. In person, but here, in my apartment, where I feel safe." "Safe?" The laugh in his voice was forced. "Mom, you're not making sense. Safe from what?" "Safe from being lied to. Safe from being stolen from. Safe from being poisoned by someone I love." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, harder, less careful about maintaining the facade. "I don't know what you think you know, Mom, but you're obviously not thinking clearly. This is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior I've been worried about. The pharmacy tested my medications, David. All of them, including the vitamins you bought for me." Another silence, longer this time. When he spoke again, the pretense was gone entirely. "You don't understand the situation you're in, Mom. You're getting old. You're making mistakes. Someone needs to make sure you don't hurt yourself or lose everything Dad worked so hard for. Someone like you? I'm your son. I'm the only family you have left." And there it was. The threat wrapped in concern, the manipulation disguised as love. But I wasn't the same woman who would have crumbled under that pressure 6 months ago. I wasn't even the same woman who would have believed those words a week ago. "You're right," I said quietly. "You are my son, and that makes what you've done even worse." I hung up before he could respond, then immediately called Dr. Martinez. She answered on the second ring, even though it was Sunday morning, and when I explained what I'd discovered, her concern was immediate and genuine. "Eleanor, you need to see me tomorrow morning first thing. We need to run a complete blood panel, check for any lasting damage, and you need to report this to Adult Protective Services immediately." Monday morning, I sat in a sterile government office in Lower Manhattan, telling my story to a social worker named Janet Rodriguez. Janet was younger than David, probably in her 30s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded me of the best teachers I'd worked with over the years. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, reviewing the medical evidence and pharmacy reports I'd brought, "this is a clear case of elder financial abuse with associated physical endangerment. We need to move quickly to protect your assets and your safety." She helped me change the passwords on all my accounts. set up new banking arrangements that required multiple forms of identification, and arranged for a legal consultation with an attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases. The lawyer, Margaret Chen, had offices near City Hall in a building that smelled like old wood and fresh coffee. She reviewed my case with the kind of careful attention that made me feel heard for the first time in months. "Eleanor," she said, "you have several options here. We can pursue criminal charges for the medication tampering. That's assault, potentially attempted homicide, depending on the prosecutor's interpretation. We can also file civil charges for the financial theft, which based on your bank records appears to be substantial." The numbers were staggering when laid out in black and white. Over the past 18 months, David had taken nearly $87,000 from my various accounts. Money from the stock portfolio Robert and I had built together. Funds from the modest Bitcoin investment that had grown surprisingly well. The cash I'd saved from years of careful budgeting, intended to ensure I could maintain my independence as I aged. But it wasn't just the money, though that theft was devastating. It was the systematic erosion of my autonomy, my confidence, my sense of self. It was the slow poisoning designed to make me question my own mind. It was the casual cruelty of someone who was supposed to love me using that love as a weapon against me. That Tuesday afternoon, David showed up at my apartment building without warning. The doorman, Roberto, called up to ask if I wanted to see him. For a moment, I almost said yes out of pure habit. Then I remembered Kevin the pharmacist's gentle voice explaining how close I'd come to serious harm, how the combination of medications David had been giving me could have caused falls, heart problems, potentially even death. "Tell him I'm not available," I said into the intercom. 20 minutes later, my buzzer rang insistently. David's voice crackled through the speaker, angry now, all pretense abandoned. "Mom, open the door. We need to talk about this ridiculous accusation you're making." I didn't answer. I sat in my living room, surrounded by the photographs and memories of a life I'd built with love and care, and I let him ring that buzzer until he gave up. He called my phone next, then sent a series of text messages that grew increasingly desperate and threatening. Accusations that I was losing my mind. Promises that he only wanted to help. Threats about what would happen if I continued to embarrass the family with my paranoid delusions. I saved every message. Margaret Chen had told me to document everything, and I was learning to protect myself in ways I'd never imagined needing. Wednesday brought another surprise. A call from David's wife, Sarah. I hadn't spoken to Sarah in months, not since David had gradually cut off most of my contact with my daughter-in-law and grandson. Sarah's voice was nervous, apologetic, but also relieved. "Eleanor," she said carefully, "I need you to know that I had no idea what David was doing to you. I knew he was taking money. He said you were giving it to him willingly. But the medications, I never knew about that." She paused, then continued in a rush. "He's been different lately. Angry all the time. Obsessed with money. Talking about how you were going to waste his inheritance if someone didn't step in. I was starting to get scared, to be honest. Scared of what he might do." Sarah revealed things that made the pattern clearer and more chilling. David had been researching elder care facilities, looking for places to put me where he could have complete control over my finances. He'd been consulting with a lawyer about having me declared incompetent. The medication tampering wasn't random. It was designed to create documented evidence of cognitive decline that could be used in court. "He has our son convinced that you're sick, that you don't remember things properly," Sarah said, crying now. "But Tommy misses you so much, Eleanor. He keeps asking why Grandma doesn't call anymore, why we don't visit you." Tommy, my grandson, 8 years old, with Robert's eyes and my stubborn chin. David had been using my supposed incompetence to justify cutting me off from Tommy, denying me the relationship with my grandchild that had been one of the few bright spots in my increasingly isolated life. That Wednesday evening, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. I called Margaret Chen and told her I wanted to pursue every legal option available. Criminal charges for the assault, civil charges for the theft, a restraining order to keep David away from me and my property. Thursday morning, police officers came to my apartment to take my statement. Detective Williams and Detective Park were professional, thorough, and surprisingly gentle as they documented the evidence of what they called a sophisticated case of elder abuse with intent to defraud. As I told my story to those detectives, speaking the words aloud to official observers, I felt something shifting inside me. The shame I'd been carrying, the feeling that somehow I should have been smarter, stronger, less vulnerable, began to transform into something harder and cleaner. Anger. Righteous anger at being betrayed by someone I'd loved unconditionally. That afternoon, Sarah called again. David had been arrested at their home in Los Angeles. The charges were serious: elder abuse, fraud, assault with a dangerous substance. He was being held pending bail, and the story was already making its way through their social circle. "Eleanor," Sarah said, "I'm so sorry. I should have seen it sooner. I should have protected you." But protection, I was learning, was something I had to do for myself. No one else could give me back my sense of safety, my confidence in my own mind, my right to make my own decisions. Those were things I had to reclaim through my own choices, my own strength. Friday brought a call from my dear friend Diane, someone I hadn't spoken to in months because David had convinced me that maintaining friendships was too stressful for someone my age. Diane had heard through mutual acquaintances about what had happened, and her voice was fierce with protective love. "Eleanor Patterson," she said, "why didn't you call me? 30 years of friendship, and you thought you had to handle this alone." I couldn't answer right away because I was crying, not the helpless tears of the past months, but tears of relief, of recognition, of coming home to myself. Diane insisted on coming over that very afternoon, arriving with homemade soup and the kind of no-nonsense caring that reminded me I wasn't actually alone in the world. As we sat in my kitchen, sharing that soup and talking about everything that had happened, Diane helped me see something I'd been missing. "You know what this is?" she said, gesturing around my apartment, at the life I'd been fighting to protect. "This is your story, your home, your choices, your independence. And you saved it, Eleanor. You saved yourself. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, bought a membership, wandered through rooms full of beauty and history and human creativity. I stood in front of paintings that had survived centuries, in rooms filled with artifacts from civilizations that had risen and fallen and left their mark on the world. I thought about resilience, about the human capacity to endure, to fight, to rebuild, about the strength that comes not from never falling down, but from getting back up every single time. Sunday evening, I called my neighbor from the building, Mrs. Hernandez, who lived 2 floors down. Carmen Hernandez had emigrated from Puerto Rico 40 years ago, raised 3 children while working as a hospital aide, and had been offering me small kindnesses for years. Help with groceries when the elevator was broken, invitations to family celebrations, the gift of her presence whenever I seemed lonely. "Mija," she said when I told her what had been happening, "you should have told me sooner. Nobody should fight these battles alone." Carmen introduced me to a world I'd been missing, her extended family of neighbors and friends who looked out for each other, who shared resources and support without keeping careful tallies of who owed what to whom. It was a different model of family from the one I'd known, based not on obligation or guilt, but on genuine care and mutual respect. The following week, I received a call from Adult Protective Services. David had been released on bail and was attempting to contest the restraining order, claiming I was mentally incompetent and being manipulated by outside parties. The case would require court testimony, medical evaluations, a thorough review of my capacity to make my own decisions. For a moment, the old fear crept back in. What if they believed him? What if his lies about my mental state were convincing enough to give him legal control over my life? But then I remembered Dr. Martinez's latest evaluation, conducted after I'd stopped taking the tampered medications. My blood work was normal. My cognitive function tests showed no signs of dementia or significant impairment. Most importantly, I felt like myself again, clear-headed, decisive, capable of protecting my own interests. The court hearing was scheduled for the following month. Margaret Chen prepared me carefully, explaining that David's lawyer would try to paint me as a confused old woman who didn't understand what was happening to her. They would present my accusations as paranoid delusions, my desire for independence as dangerous stubbornness. "But we have the evidence," Margaret reminded me. "The pharmacy tests, the medical records, the financial documentation, and we have you. A woman who was strong enough to investigate her own situation, smart enough to gather proof, and brave enough to take action. During those weeks of waiting, I began to rebuild my life in ways that seemed small, but felt revolutionary. I enrolled in a painting class at the 92nd Street Y, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. I started cooking real meals again, not just heating up canned soup because I was too tired and confused to do more. I reconnected with old friends, including my former teaching colleague Janet Miller, who had retired to Florida but still called New York home. Janet flew up for a visit, and we spent hours walking through Central Park, talking about our careers, our dreams, the children we'd taught and loved and watched grow up. "You know what I see when I look at you now?" Janet said as we sat by the Bethesda fountain, watching tourists and locals share the same beautiful space. "I see the woman I worked with for 15 years. Strong, smart, nobody's fool. I was worried about you after Robert died. But this, what you've done to protect yourself, this is the Eleanor I've always known." One evening, about 3 weeks before the court date, Sarah called with news that broke my heart and filled me with hope at the same time. She was filing for divorce from David and seeking full custody of Tommy. She wanted to bring my grandson to see me, to rebuild the relationship David had been systematically destroying. "He talks about you all the time," Sarah said. "He has this picture of you and him at Coney Island last summer, before everything got so bad. He keeps asking when he can see Grandma Eleanor again. The thought of seeing Tommy again, of being part of his life without David's manipulation and control, gave me strength I didn't know I still possessed. I started planning activities we could do together. Trips to the Museum of Natural History, walks in Central Park, teaching him to bake the chocolate chip cookies that had been his favorite when he was little. But first, I had to get through the court hearing. I had to face David in person for the first time since I'd discovered what he'd been doing to me, and I had to convince a judge that I was competent to make my own decisions about my money, my health, my life. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I walked around my apartment, touching familiar objects, remembering the life Robert and I had built together. His books were still on the shelves, some marked with his careful notes in the margins. My teaching certificates hung in frames near the kitchen, reminders of the career that had given me purpose and independence for 32 years. I thought about all the third graders I'd taught over the decades, children who came to me scared or angry or confused, who left my classroom stronger and more confident in their ability to learn and grow. I'd spent my career helping children find their voices, overcome their fears, stand up for themselves. Now it was time to stand up for myself. The courthouse in Lower Manhattan was intimidating. Marble floors, high ceilings, the weight of legal authority pressing down on everyone who entered. But as I walked through those doors with Margaret Chen beside me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. I felt powerful. David was already there with his lawyer, a sharp-dressed man who looked like he specialized in making vulnerable people seem incompetent. David himself looked older than I remembered, gray around the temples, lines of stress and anger marking his face. When our eyes met across the courthouse hallway, I saw something that surprised me: fear. He was afraid of me, afraid of what I might say, afraid of losing control of the narrative he'd constructed. The hearing itself was both terrifying and liberating. David's lawyer painted me as exactly what I'd expected: a confused elderly woman, susceptible to manipulation, no longer capable of managing her own affairs. He presented David as a concerned son, trying to protect his mother from her own poor judgment. But when it was my turn to testify, I spoke in the clear, steady voice I'd used for decades to command the attention of 8-year-olds. I presented the evidence methodically: the pharmacy tests, the financial records, the pattern of lies and manipulation. I answered every question directly, precisely, without hesitation or confusion. Most importantly, I explained why I'd taken action to protect myself. "Your Honor," I said, looking directly at the judge, "I spent 32 years teaching children that they deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. I refuse to accept less for myself simply because I'm old enough to be someone's victim." The judge's decision was swift and unambiguous. The restraining order would remain in place. David would face criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud. Most importantly, the court found me fully competent to manage my own affairs, free to make my own decisions about my money, my health, and my relationships. As we left the courthouse that day, Margaret Chen smiled at me with genuine admiration. "Eleanor," she said, "in 25 years of practicing law, I've rarely seen anyone fight back as effectively as you did. You should be proud of yourself." But the real test came later, when I was alone in my apartment, processing what had happened. The legal victory was important, but it was only the beginning. I still had to rebuild my sense of safety, my confidence in my own judgment, my trust in the possibility of healthy relationships. That evening, Carmen Hernandez knocked on my door with a pot of her famous arroz con pollo and a bottle of wine. We sat in my kitchen as the sun set over the city, talking about families and betrayal and the strength it takes to start over at any age. "You know what I learned when I left my first husband?" Carmen said, raising her glass in a toast. "I learned that being alone is better than being with someone who makes you feel small. And being strong is better than being safe if safety comes at the cost of your soul." 2 weeks after the hearing, Sarah and Tommy arrived for their visit. I was so nervous I changed clothes 3 times, worried that somehow the trauma of the past months had changed me in ways that would frighten or confuse my grandson. But when Tommy ran into my apartment and threw his arms around my waist, when he looked up at me with those familiar eyes full of love and excitement, I knew that the most important parts of me had not only survived, but grown stronger. "Grandma," he said, "Mom told me you were sick, but you look just the same as always. Can we make cookies? Can you tell me about when Grandpa was in the Navy? Can we go to the museum like we used to?" "Yes," I told him. Yes to all of it. Yes to the cookies and the stories and the museum trips. Yes to being his grandmother without fear or conditions or the constant anxiety of someone else's approval. Yes to the relationship David had tried to steal from both of us. That weekend with Tommy reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten: the pure joy of being loved for who I am, not for what I can provide. He didn't care about my money or my assets or my capacity to solve his problems. He just wanted his grandmother back, wanted the security of knowing I would always be there for him. As Sarah prepared to leave for Los Angeles, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for fighting back. Thank you for being strong enough to stop him. Tommy needs to know that people can stand up for themselves, that being old doesn't mean being helpless." The months that followed brought a series of small victories and ongoing challenges. The criminal case against David moved slowly through the legal system, requiring depositions and evidence reviews and court appearances that forced me to relive the worst months of my life over and over again. But I also discovered new sources of strength and joy. The painting class at the 92nd Street Y introduced me to a group of women my age who were exploring creativity and self-expression, with the freedom that comes from having nothing left to prove to anyone. My paintings were amateur at best, but the act of putting color on canvas, of creating something beautiful from nothing, felt like a metaphor for rebuilding my life. I joined a support group for elder abuse survivors, meeting once a week in the basement of a church on the Upper West Side. Listening to other people's stories, some similar to mine, others involving different forms of exploitation and betrayal, helped me understand that I wasn't alone, that what had happened to me was part of a larger pattern of how society sometimes fails to protect its most vulnerable members. But more than that, I learned from watching other survivors rebuild their lives. Marjorie, a 78-year-old retired nurse whose daughter had stolen her entire retirement savings, had started a small business making jewelry from her apartment. Frank, an 82-year-old widower whose son had forged his signature on legal documents, had become an advocate for other elderly men facing financial abuse. Their examples showed me that survival wasn't enough. I wanted to transform my experience into something useful, something that might help other people recognize the warning signs earlier than I had. 6 months after the court hearing, I received a call from Janet Rodriguez at Adult Protective Services. They were developing an educational program for seniors about financial abuse and elder exploitation, and they wanted me to help create materials based on my experience. The idea terrified and energized me in equal measure. Speaking publicly about what David had done, sharing the intimate details of my vulnerability and manipulation, felt like the ultimate exposure. But it also felt like the completion of something important, turning my pain into a tool that might protect others. I started speaking at senior centers, community groups, and legal aid organizations. Each time I told my story, I saw recognition in someone's eyes, the dawning awareness that their own situation might be more dangerous than they'd realized, or the relief of finally having words for experiences they couldn't previously name. One evening, after a presentation at a senior center in Brooklyn, an elderly man approached me with tears in his eyes. His son had been slowly taking control of his finances, using similar tactics to what David had employed: accusations of forgetfulness, concerns about mental capacity, the gradual assumption of more and more responsibility. "I thought I was going crazy," he said. "I thought I was imagining things, being paranoid. But listening to you tonight, I realize I need to get help before it's too late." That conversation reminded me why the speaking engagements were important despite their emotional cost. Every person who recognized the pattern early, who sought help before the damage became irreversible, represented a small victory against the kind of predatory behavior that thrives on shame and silence. The first anniversary of my discovery of David's crimes passed quietly. I marked the date not with grief, but with gratitude. Gratitude for my own strength, for the friends who had supported me, for the legal system that had protected me, and, most importantly, for the clarity to recognize my own worth. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a cup of tea and a photo album. Not the painful exercise in nostalgia it might have been a year earlier, but a celebration of resilience. Pictures of my teaching career, my marriage to Robert, the early years of David's childhood when our relationship was built on genuine love rather than exploitation. I could see now that the warning signs had been there much earlier than I'd originally realized. The gradual increase in financial requests, the subtle dismissal of my opinions and preferences, the way David had begun to speak about me to others as if I were an object to be managed rather than a person to be respected. But I could also see moments of strength I'd forgotten, times when I'd questioned his behavior, pushed back against his control, maintained my independence despite his efforts to undermine it. The woman who had eventually saved herself had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to emerge. 1 year later, the criminal case finally concluded. David pleaded guilty to elder abuse and financial fraud charges. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution for the money he'd stolen. More importantly for me, the conviction created a legal record that would protect other potential victims from similar schemes. Sarah divorced him while he was in prison, and she and Tommy moved to New York to be closer to me. Not because I needed caretaking or management, but because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company and wanted to rebuild the family relationships that David's manipulation had nearly destroyed. Tommy, now 9 years old and wise beyond his years, understood more about what had happened than any child should have to know. But he also understood that his grandmother had fought back, had refused to be victimized, had chosen her own safety and dignity over the appearance of family harmony. "Grandma," he said one afternoon as we walked through Central Park, "I'm proud of you for being brave. I hope when I'm old like you, I'll be that brave too. Old like me." The words that might have stung a year earlier now felt like a badge of honor. I was old enough to have learned from decades of experience, old enough to recognize my own value, old enough to refuse to accept less than I deserved from anyone, including my own family. 2 years after that terrible discovery in the pharmacy, my life looked completely different. I still lived in the same apartment, but it felt like home again rather than a prison. My relationship with Tommy was stronger than ever, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than the artificial constraints David had imposed. I had new friends from my painting class, my support group, my speaking engagements. I had a sense of purpose that came from helping others avoid the trap I'd fallen into. Most importantly, I had reclaimed my faith in my own judgment, my right to make decisions about my own life. The financial damage David had caused was significant, but not catastrophic. With careful budgeting and the restitution payments, I was able to maintain my independence, keep my apartment, and continue supporting the causes and people I genuinely cared about. Not because they manipulated me, but because I chose to help them. I still missed Robert every day, but I no longer felt that his death had left me defenseless. I'd learned that protection had to come from within, from my own strength and wisdom and refusal to accept mistreatment. The medications David had tampered with left no permanent damage, according to Dr. Martinez's ongoing monitoring. My trembling hands were steady now. My memory was clear, sharp, unimpaired by the substances he'd been using to create artificial symptoms of decline. But the emotional damage took longer to heal. Learning to trust my own judgment again, to believe in my right to say no, to recognize manipulation when it appeared, those were ongoing processes that required constant vigilance and self-compassion. 3 years after the court hearing, I received an unexpected letter. David, writing from prison, asking for forgiveness, claiming he'd gotten help, promising he'd changed. The letter was full of the same manipulation I'd learned to recognize. Appeals to family loyalty, suggestions that I was being cruel and unforgiving, implications that a good mother would give him another chance. I read the letter once, carefully, then threw it away. Some bridges once burned should stay burned. Some relationships once poisoned cannot be safely restored. Some forgiveness is really just another form of self-harm. Instead of responding to David, I wrote a different kind of letter. To myself, to the woman I'd been 3 years earlier, frightened and confused, and slowly being destroyed by someone she trusted completely. Dear Eleanor, I wrote, you are stronger than you know. You are smarter than they want you to believe. You deserve respect, kindness, and love without conditions. Trust yourself, protect yourself, save yourself. No one else can do it for you, but you have everything you need inside you already. I folded that letter carefully and put it in the same drawer where I once kept Robert's letters from Vietnam. But this time, the paper didn't smell like old love and faded dreams. It smelled like possibility, like the lavender soap I used every morning, like the future I was still creating for myself. That summer, I did something I'd dreamed about for years but never made time for. I took a trip to Europe, a river cruise through the heart of the continent with a group of other older travelers. For 10 days, I walked through cobblestone streets, visited museums filled with treasures from across centuries, tasted wine and food and culture that reminded me how vast and beautiful the world could be. On that trip, I met a man named Henry, a retired professor from Chicago whose wife had died 2 years earlier. We weren't looking for romance. We were both too wise and too wounded for that kind of foolishness. But we discovered a friendship based on mutual interest, shared experiences, and the simple pleasure of each other's company. Henry came to visit me in New York that fall, and I traveled to Chicago to see him in the spring. We wrote letters, talked on the phone, shared books and opinions, and the quiet comfort of being understood by someone who had also survived loss and betrayal, and the challenge of starting over in the later chapters of life. The thing about us, Henry said during one of his visits, as we sat in my living room watching the sunset paint the city gold, is that we know who we are. We're not trying to become something for someone else's benefit. We can just be ourselves. And that's enough. Being enough. That was the lesson I'd learned at such a high cost. That I was enough, exactly as I was, without needing to purchase love or approval or family loyalty. I was enough to deserve respect, protection, kindness. I was enough to make my own decisions, manage my own life, choose my own relationships. 4 years after that first terrible discovery, Tommy graduated from elementary school. Sarah and I sat together in the school auditorium, watching my grandson receive an award for academic excellence, and I felt a pride that was pure and uncomplicated by fear or manipulation or hidden agendas. After the ceremony, Tommy ran to us with his certificate, his face bright with accomplishment. "Grandma," he said, "I wrote about you for my essay about heroes. I wrote about how you saved yourself from the bad people and taught me that being brave means standing up for what's right, even when it's scary. Heroes. I'd spent 78 years thinking that heroes were people who saved others, who sacrificed themselves for the greater good, who put everyone else's needs ahead of their own. But maybe the most heroic thing I'd ever done was save myself, recognize my own worth, fight for my own safety, refuse to accept abuse disguised as love." That night, after the celebration dinner, after Tommy and Sarah had gone home to their apartment across town, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the journey from that terrible morning 4 years earlier, when I'd first noticed the tampered medication bottles. The woman who had discovered those bottles was brave, but she didn't know it yet. She was strong, but she'd forgotten. She was worthy of love and respect, but she'd been trained to believe otherwise. The woman sitting in my kitchen that night, older, wiser, more careful about trust but more confident in her own judgment, was the same person with the same inherent value. The difference was that now I knew it. Now I lived it. Now I protected it. 5 years after the court hearing, I received news that David had been released from prison. Sarah thought I should know in case he tried to contact me, but she needn't have worried. The restraining order was still in effect, and more importantly, I was no longer the vulnerable target I'd once been. I'd learned to recognize manipulation in all its forms. I'd built a support network of friends and professionals who looked out for my well-being without trying to control it. I'd established legal and financial safeguards that would make it much harder for anyone to exploit me again. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust the voice inside me that said no when something felt wrong, that questioned relationships that seemed to require me to diminish myself, that insisted on respect as the baseline for any interaction. David never contacted me directly after his release. I heard through Sarah that he'd moved to another state, that he'd found work in construction, that he claimed to be a changed man. Maybe he was. Maybe prison and counseling and the consequences of his actions had taught him something about treating people with dignity. But his transformation, genuine or not, was irrelevant to my life. I'd moved beyond needing his apology or acknowledgement or change. I'd built a life that was insulated from his capacity to harm me, not because I lived in fear, but because I lived with wisdom. The speaking engagements I'd begun doing years earlier had evolved into something more structured. I worked with Adult Protective Services to develop training materials for healthcare workers, financial institutions, and family members about recognizing and preventing elder abuse. My story became part of a larger educational effort that reached thousands of people each year. But the most meaningful feedback came from individuals. The woman who left an abusive adult son's home after hearing my presentation. The man who sought legal help when he recognized the financial manipulation I described. The family member who learned to support an elderly relative without taking over their autonomy. Each of those stories reminded me that survival without purpose is incomplete. My experience of victimization and recovery had meaning beyond my own healing. It could serve as a warning, a guide, a source of hope for others facing similar challenges. 6 years after that first pharmacy visit, I celebrated my 80th birthday surrounded by people who loved me for who I was, not what I could provide for them. Tommy, now 15 and taller than his grandfather had been, gave a toast that brought tears to my eyes. My grandmother taught me that family isn't about blood or obligation, he said, raising his glass of sparkling cider. It's about respect and kindness and standing up for each other. She taught me that being strong doesn't mean never getting hurt. It means knowing you deserve better when someone hurts you. Henry was there, still my dear friend after all these years of letters and visits and shared adventures. Carmen Hernandez and her extended family, who had become my chosen relatives. My painting class friends, my support group colleagues, the network of connections I'd built based on mutual care rather than dependency or exploitation. Looking around that room, I realized that the family David had threatened to take away from me, the one he'd claimed was his to give or withhold based on my compliance with his demands, had never really existed in the first place. Real family, I'd learned, was about protection, not predation, about lifting each other up, not tearing each other down. The money David had stolen had been significant, but the transformation he'd unwittingly catalyzed was worth more than any financial loss. I'd found my voice, my strength, my unshakable sense of self-worth. I'd learned that love without respect is not love at all, but a kind of emotional slavery disguised as devotion. As I write this story now, 7 years after that first terrible discovery, I want you to know something important. If you recognize pieces of your own life in what I've shared, if you see patterns of manipulation or financial abuse or emotional control that feel familiar, please know that you're not imagining things. Trust your instincts. Document what's happening. Seek help from professionals who understand these dynamics. Most importantly, remember that you deserve better. Age doesn't make you expendable. Vulnerability doesn't make you worthless. Family relationships that require you to accept mistreatment are not really family relationships at all. They're power structures designed to benefit someone else at your expense. I'm 81 years old now, and I've never been happier or more confident in my own skin. I live independently, travel when I want to, maintain relationships that nourish rather than drain me. I've learned that the fear of being alone is nothing compared to the fear of being with people who make you feel small, confused, or unworthy. The trembling in my hands that started this whole story was indeed a symptom of something serious. Not age or illness, but poisoning. The confusion and memory problems that made me doubt my own mind were real, but artificially induced. The financial difficulties that made me feel insecure were the result of theft, not poor management. Once I removed the source of those problems, once I protected myself from the person who was causing them, everything changed. My health improved, my mind cleared, my finances stabilized, my sense of self-worth returned. But the most important change was internal. I learned to value my own opinion of myself more than anyone else's opinion of me. I learned that being a good person doesn't require accepting bad treatment. I learned that saying no to people who exploit you is actually saying yes to your own dignity. I think about Robert sometimes, and I believe he would be proud of the woman I became after losing him. Not because I needed his approval to validate my choices, but because I know he loved me and wanted me to be safe, happy, and free to make my own decisions. The photographs on my mantelpiece tell a different story now. There are new pictures. Tommy at his high school graduation, my painting class exhibition, Henry and me at the Louvre, Carmen's granddaughter's quinceañera where I was honored as an honorary grandmother. The old photos are still there, but they no longer carry the weight of loss and betrayal. They're simply memories of different chapters in a long, complex, ultimately triumphant life. If you're listening to this story and feeling trapped in a similar situation, please remember, it's never too late to save yourself. It's never too late to demand respect. It's never too late to recognize your own worth and fight to protect it. The systems that allowed David to exploit me for so long, the cultural assumption that adult children naturally know what's best for aging parents, the tendency to dismiss elderly people's concerns as confusion or paranoia, the shame that keeps victims from speaking up. Those systems are still in place, but they can be challenged, overcome, defeated by people who refuse to accept abuse as the price of family connection. You don't have to choose between being alone and being mistreated. There are other options, other kinds of relationships, other ways of structuring your life that honor both your need for connection and your right to respect. The doctor who whispered, "We need to act now," was talking about the immediate medical crisis caused by David's tampering with my medications. But those words apply to every aspect of what I experienced. When someone is systematically undermining your autonomy, stealing your resources, poisoning your sense of self, you need to act now. Not later, when the damage becomes irreversible. Not when you're stronger or surer or less afraid. Now, while you still can. I acted, and it saved my life. Not just from the physical danger of the tampered medications, but from the spiritual death of accepting abuse as love, exploitation as family loyalty, control as care. 7 years later, I'm still acting, still speaking out, still helping others recognize the warning signs, still choosing relationships that honor rather than diminish me. Every day that I wake up in my own apartment, make my own decisions, spend my own money on causes and people I genuinely care about, every one of those days is a victory over the forces that tried to reduce me to an object to be managed. The sun sets over Manhattan as I finish writing this, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that remind me why I've always loved this city. New York taught me that you can be surrounded by millions of people and still feel lonely, but it also taught me that strength comes from within, that survival requires constant vigilance, and that the most beautiful things in life, friendship, art, love, dignity, can't be bought or sold or stolen if you guard them carefully enough. I am Eleanor Patterson, I am 81 years old. I am a survivor, a teacher, a grandmother, a friend. I am worth protecting, deserving of respect, entitled to make my own choices about my own life. And so are you. Have you ever lived something similar to what I've shared? Do you know someone who might be facing the kind of manipulation and abuse I experienced? Please, share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to protect themselves. If this story touched you, if it helped you see something clearly that you hadn't understood before, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Together, we can make sure these stories reach the people who need to hear them most. Together, we can break the silence that allows elder abuse to flourish in the shadows. Remember, you are never too old to save yourself. You are never too vulnerable to demand respect. You are never too alone to find people who will value you for who you are, not what you can give them. The best revenge against those who try to diminish us is to live fully, love wisely, and refuse to let their damage define our story. That's what I've done. That's what you can do too. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being part of the solution.